Hello, my name is Paul Leadley. I'm a professor at Paris-Saclay University, and today we're going to be presenting you science briefs that we've prepared in support of negotiations of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And this video is particular about the ecosystem area and integrity components of the Global Biodiversity Framework.
And hi, my name is David Obura. I'm a coral reef researcher at CORDIO East Africa, based in Kenya. And we work on coral reefs and ocean monitoring systems globally, and I've been very much involved in the IPBES process. And together with Paul and this organizing team, and brought together by Discovery of Future Earth and GeoBon, we've brought together a team of scientists. And if you can go to the next slide, please, Paul. Over 50 scientists who have participated in multiple information documents feeding into the Global Biodiversity Framework process, so early in 2020, and then again before the Geneva meetings earlier this year. Then following Geneva meetings, we really identified that there was a need for more target-focused briefs to bring the science into focus for the OEWG4 about to meet in the monitoring workshop. So we've prepared four targets, 3, 7, 8, and 9, this ecosystem area and integrity brief that is the subject of our video today, and a monitoring framework brief, which you can find information on those in our last slide. So ecosystem area and integrity is one of the critical aspects of the Global Biodiversity Framework. It's really a foundation of Goal A. And actions across multiple targets in the framework are necessary to increase the area of natural ecosystems and the integrity of natural and managed ecosystems. Now, targets 1, 2, and 3 are very much area-based, as well as target 10 as well. And in considering individual briefs for these targets, we really realized that we needed to establish the clear links of these targets together into Goal A, as this was somewhat lacking in the first draft. We'll focus on area in this presentation. Integrity is also important, but we deal with that in the information document that we prepared. And a critical aspect which you'll hear now is that we need clear definitions for these aspects, because negotiating these complex targets with only partially agreed definitions and terms has been very tricky.
Thank you, David. So what I'd like to do now is to explore some of these relationships between Goal A, and in particular the net gain in natural ecosystem area component of Goal A and its relationship to targets. And what we want to do is boil this down to a very simple relationship. We've done this in past information documents, talking about how you would actually achieve net gains, primarily going through very sophisticated scenarios. What we're trying to do is really boil this down to something very simple, and that is that the net gain or loss of natural ecosystem area is simply how much you restore minus how much you lose. And if you want to calculate that, the percent net gain, which is the component that's in Goal A, it's that net gain or loss divided by the fraction of ecosystems globally that are natural ecosystems. And so what we've done is to look at how you would actually achieve, for example, a 5% gain in natural terrestrial ecosystem area by 2030. What would you actually need to do? In order to make this calculation, you need to know what the global area of natural ecosystems is. And surprisingly, it's not incredibly well bounded, but it's essentially the 13,000 million hectares of ice-free land divided by 2. So about 50% of that land is actually a natural area. Then you have to make some estimation of how much you're going to reduce losses. So we're roughly around a loss of 20 million hectares of natural area per year. We've made an assumption that you would actually reduce that loss by 75% starting in 2023. And then you can calculate how much area you'd actually have to restore in order to achieve this goal of a 5% net gain. And that turns out to be 400 million hectares. Now, people may not have a good handle on millions of hectares, but Perhaps one of the best numbers to compare that with is the Bond Challenge for forest restoration, which is 350 million hectares globally. And I'll get back to that number in just a second. So that gives a good sense of what we need to do. That is very large scale restoration of ecosystems, but really important that this is the restoration of ecosystems that have been transformed from natural areas to croplands or grasslands or intensively managed forests back to natural ecosystems. And it has to be a very ambitious target. We estimate around 350 to 400 million hectares over that period of 2020 to 2030. And it requires also very substantial reductions in losses. Then we can look at several scenarios. Well, first, perhaps one of the most important things is that what we found looking at the goal A and the targets is that the way that they're worded in the first draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework doesn't actually allow you to make these calculations very easily, because they're not worded in a way that makes this easy to do. And certainly the quantitative objectives in targets 1 and targets 2 and targets 3 don't actually allow you to make these calculations. What we wanted to do then was to give you people an idea of what this would look like going out to 2050. So we've made those calculations out to 2050, and essentially what that implies, if you want to get to 15% net gain in natural area, is that you halt all losses of natural ecosystems starting in 2031, and that there's very large-scale restoration of transformed ecosystems back to natural ecosystems. So you can ask the question then, what happens if we don't do anything? And we've made some very simple business as usual scenarios. Essentially, we're just taking current trends in losses and some reasonable estimations of restoration to try and estimate what business as usual would look like. And in both the 2030 and 2050, those are actually net losses of natural areas. And what's really important is to give a broad sense of these kinds of numbers. What we've also done is compared those to much more sophisticated scenarios, and what those scenarios based primarily on integrated assessment models tell us is that restoring 400 million hectares of land by 2030 is very ambitious. Reducing losses by 75% would actually require very substantial changes towards more sustainable production, especially in agricultural systems on land. But it's probably doable. And the same for 15% by 2050. It would really require very ambitious transformative change to reach those kinds of levels, but they are within the scope of what integrated assessment models suggest is feasible. And based on this and many other considerations in the brief, we have a number of suggestions. And again, this is not intended to be at all prescriptive, a number of suggestions about rewording of the Goal A, Targets 1 and Targets 2. So from a Goal A perspective, we don't have a lot to say other than that maybe the 2030 goal could be integrated, a milestone could be integrated directly into Goal A. And that the 5% and by 2030 and 15% objective for 2050 are very ambitious and require transformative change, but appear to be feasible under those conditions. And just a reminder that both our analysis, but also the analyses that have been done by the CBD Secretariat and Open-Ended Working Group co-chairs has primarily been focusing on terrestrial ecosystems, and there's really going to have to be a much deeper consideration of the differences between terrestrial, freshwater, and marine ecosystems when thinking about these quantitative objectives. So for Target 1, a number of key points come out of this kind of analysis. First of all, the net gain policy. So Goal A is based on a net gain phrasing. They these policies generally only work well when they have explicit objectives for reducing losses. That was the losses component of this equation that I showed earlier. And the first draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework is lacking any specific mention of reducing losses. Now, spatial planning can play a really important role in reducing losses, but again, our analysis of what's been done in spatial planning up to now suggests that spatial planning doesn't work well for biodiversity unless reducing losses is a clear objective of that. Now, the current wording of Target 1 is very ambiguous about how ambitious it is in terms of reducing losses. So a clear objective for reducing losses, perhaps in Target 1, would allow for a follow-up of the ACHI Target 5 and would create much greater coherence with Goal A. And there was mentioned a number of alternatives in Geneva that contained wording around reducing losses. Just a little bit of background before we get to Target 2. This is a very complicated slide, and you can see this in more detail in the brief, but it's essentially showing that restoration actions are very different in terms of what they do. So some of them actually do increase natural ecosystem areas. So when you take a transformed ecosystem like a cropland or a pasture and you transform it back, you restore it to a natural state, that increases the area of natural ecosystems. But there's lots of other restoration actions that actually don't increase the area of natural ecosystems, and some of them actually don't even increase very much the integrity of ecosystems. And so the Bond Challenge is a good example of that. Much less than half of the Bond Challenge would actually create new natural forests, and actually much of it actually wouldn't even increase the integrity of most forests because they're plantations of exotic species of trees. So then we can come to some suggestions for Target 2 concerning restoration. That is that not all restoration actions create new natural ecosystem area or contribute significantly to increasing ecosystem integrity. So it's really important to differentiate those kinds of different restoration actions. So Target 2 would benefit from a very clear statement of why you're doing restoration. Perhaps a topology of restoration actions saying, this action contributes to area, this action contributes to integrity would help clarify what restoration actually means in Target 2. And finally, what we also show is that the progress towards a quantitative objective for restoration expressed either in percent or in area can only be evaluated if it's expressed in terms of absolute area, so for example of millions of hectares of land restored, or if you know how much degraded land area you have, and that would have to be agreed upon because currently the estimates of degraded land vary way too much in order to make it possible to assess progress towards this. Now, one of the most important issues is not just setting this global goals and setting these global targets, but also the translation to national scales. And that's what David's going to talk about right now.
Thanks, Paul. So in this slide, and the next slide, what we tried to do is just to show some just hypothetical national cases, examples of how these area-based targets may look played out at the national scale. These are very simple pictograms. We've made some very simplifying assumptions. We're only looking at land in these examples. And we're incorporating the aspect of Goal A to 2030, so this 5% net gain that Paul mentioned. And we're not addressing the integrity targets because this is just an illustration of the area that's involved. The integrity targets or goals would take much longer to play out. And this initial pictogram shows the case now in 2022, planning the GBF. We show the area of natural and managed ecosystems, approximately 53 and 48 or 47% across the world. HE target 11, we have 17% of protected areas, predominantly in natural and intact areas, and then a very small percentage under cities and infrastructure. And then this issue of degraded ecosystems, as Paul mentioned, it's not very well defined what degraded ecosystems are, but we've used an assumption here and it's equivalent to, say, 16% globally. And if you play out this pictogram to 2030, then what you can see that we are showing this increase. I don't see the slide changing actually, Paul. We can see, thanks, the increase in natural area of 5% that is included under Goal A, a slight increase in the area of green there. You can see an increase in the protected and conserved areas to the 30% target under Target 3. But then also importantly, this area under restoration, which we assume is at about 20% of the degraded area. And that is split across multiple landscapes, across natural managed landscapes, but also in protected and conserved areas. And importantly, under Target 10, all of that managed lands is placed under sustainable production or sustainable management targets and practices. And under Target 1A, or the first part of Target 1, is that 100% of spatial planning is undertaken across all countries globally. So that's the overall, the average condition. And what we've done in the brief is just to present three very basic examples. So one clear example is where you countries that has a very high percentage of natural area, a low area of farms and cities. A second case, which is perhaps a more common condition of many countries around the world, where there's relatively low natural area that's remaining, but very high shared spaces. So these might be where indigenous peoples and local communities are very much integrated with the lands and seascapes, and then a varied amount of farms. And then the third example is countries where almost all of their landscapes are transformed with very low percentage of natural area remaining, very high percentage of farms and intensively managed landscapes. And you can see how the proportions under each of these targets vary. The numbers are listed in the tables below. But on the left, you can see that the percentage under sort of Target 10 under managed production scapes is relatively low. But the percentage that could be protected and conserved by various governance regimes could be very high, around 50% perhaps. The area under restoration is reasonably low because there's not much degraded ecosystems in that country. And then in cases B and C, you can see that area under restoration increases significantly as you move forward. And then the example under C, where there's not much natural area remaining, but the area that can be contributed under the global targets is under 30%, but is really focused very much on the most intact and the most functioning ecosystems in that country. If you just click once more, then we can see that there's a number of caveats about realizing this across all countries. Most importantly is that directly translating the global objectives, especially the quantitative ones, to national and local levels will likely result in suboptimal use of resources for outcomes for biodiversity. And it will set ambitions too low in some cases and unrealistically high in others. So it's not really a workable solution. These national targets can be set based on national contexts, but international cooperation is essential for two main reasons. One is to balance the contributions to the global targets, to aggregate all these contributions up to the global targets across countries, but then also for resource mobilization to support implementation of the framework across all of these different cases. So we go into some detail around this in the brief. With that, we'll end this video saying thank you very much for your attention. This is the brief on the left and its code, and the individual briefs that are within, or the individual target sections within this brief are also presented on the GeoBond webpage at that URL. And with that, I'll say thank you and hand it back to Paul for his thanks.
So thank you everyone for listening. We certainly look forward to having discussions with you in Nairobi if you will be there.